Good morning. Our objectives for this lecture are to understand the neuroanatomical correlates of intelligence, memory, and emotions, and to understand the symptomatology of the dysfunctions affecting intelligence, memory, and emotions. This lecture is divided into two parts. The first part is the discussion on intelligence, memory, and emotions, and the second part is a discussion of the dysfunctions and disturbances affecting intelligence, memory, and emotions. So to start, intelligence or intelligent behavior has variously been defined as a general mental efficiency or innate cognitive ability, or the aggregate or global capacity of an individual to act purposefully, to think rationally, and to deal effectively with his environment. It is global because it characterizes an individual's behavior as a whole. It is an aggregate in the sense that it is composed of a number of independent and qualitatively distinguishable cognitive abilities. We all know that intelligence has something to do with normal cerebral function. And it is also apparent that the level of intelligence differs from one person to another. And I think we're pretty much aware of that even when we were young children, because in school there would be people who were smarter than us and there would be people who are less smart than us. The first intelligence tests were devised in 1905 for the purpose of predicting scholastic success. The term intelligence quotient was introduced by the German psychologist Stern and later on used by Terman in 1916 for the development of intelligence testing. IQ denotes the figure that is obtained by dividing the subject's mental age by his chronological age and multiplying the result by 100. An individual's IQ increases with age up to the 14th to the 16th years and then remains stable at least until late adult life. How do we know that? Because remember, when we were children in grade school and even high school, we would have periodic evaluations of our IQ by our guidance counselors or our guidance departments. But in college, it wasn't done as routinely as in our younger and more formative educational years. The intelligence quotient, or IQ, is a score derived from one of several different standardized tests which are designed to assess intelligence within a certain age group. 70% of the population would have a normal IQ roughly in the range of 100, and superior IQ is is for individuals usually in professional occupations. For those who are deemed potentially gifted, their IQ would fall in the range of at least 121, and this comprises 10% of the population. Now, genius starts at the level of IQ of 132 and above. So there's borderline genius, there is genius, and this is the average for the PhDs in physics. And then you have the geniuses that would fall into the category of the Nobel Prize winners. And we have the super geniuses, no? Like Bobby Fischer and Mozart, who would have IQs well above 164. How is intelligence formed? This has been an ongoing debate since time immemorial. Is it genetics or is it environment? Intelligence is actually a product of both the genes and the environment. But classically speaking, the original studies of pedigrees of highly intelligent and mentally less able families revealed a striking concordance between parent and child. And this lent support to the idea that intelligence is to a large extent inherited. So there is a strong suggestion that genetic endowment is the more important factor. However, there is also equally valid evidence that early learning modifies the level of ability that is finally attained by an individual. In this way, intelligence may be looked upon as a product of both the genes and the environment. And brain weight and the complexity of the convolutional pattern of the brain are not correlated with intelligence. There are several psychologic theories of intelligence. The first theory is the two-factor theory of Spearman, who noted that all the separate tests of cognitive abilities correlated with each other, suggesting that a general factor or a G factor enters into all performances. He postulated that each test measures not only this general ability, commonly identified with intelligence, but also a subsidiary of factors specific to the individual test, which he designated as the S factors. A second theory is the multifactorial theory of Thurston, and he proposed that intelligence consists of a number of entirely separable primary mental abilities, such as memory, verbal facility, numerical ability, visuospatial perception, and capacity for problem solving, all of them more or less equivalent. He proposed that these primary abilities, although correlated, are not subordinate to a more general disability, or sorry, general ability. The third theory was from Hans Eysenck, who postulated that intelligence exists in three forms: biologic, or the genetic component; social, or the development of genetic component in relation to personal relationships; and a number of specific abilities subject to measurement by psychometric tests. The fourth theory of intelligence came from Howard Gardner, who separated six categories of high-order cerebral ability but restated them in more modern terms. So there is linguistic, encompassing all language functions; musical, including composition and performance; logical mathematical, which includes the ideas and works of mathematicians; spatial intelligence, which includes artistic talent and the creation of visual impressions; bodily kinesthetic, which includes dance and athletic performance; and the personal intelligence, which includes consciousness of self and others in social interactions. He referred to each of these as intelligences, defined as the ability to solve problems or resolve difficulties and to be creative within the particular field. I am very particular with Howard Gardner because my youngest son, studies in a progressive school that maintains the multiple intelligences by Howard Gardner. There are several lines of evidence that are marshaled in support of Gardner's theory of parceling of skills and abilities. The first is that each ability may be developed to an exceptionally high level in certain individuals. So that's the level of virtuosity or genius. Second is that each ability can be lost or spared in isolation as a consequence of a lesion in a certain part of the nervous system. The third is special competence in one of these abilities may be evident at an unusually early age. And the fourth evidence is that one of or more of these abilities, in the autism spectrum in particular, may be selectively spared or developed to an abnormally high degree, and that's why we have an idiot savant or an autistic savant. So how do we measure IQ? There are several types of IQ tests, and the most common are the Stanford Binet Intelligence Scale, the Universal Nonverbal Intelligence, the Differential Ability Scales, the Peabody Individual Achievement Test, the Wechsler Individual Achievement Test, the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, and the Woodcock-Johnson 3 tests of cognitive disabilities. Please forgive me if I do not know how to pronounce these words, okay? But these tests are normally administered by psychometricians. Now we move on to the topic of memory. In popular culture, memory is often thought as some kind of physical thing that is stored in the brain, a subjective personal experience that we can recall at will. More scientifically speaking, memory is defined as the capacity to store and retrieve information. But why is it important to study a little bit about the science of memory? It's because we are who we are in great measure because of what we learn and what we remember. One way of understanding memory is to think about it in terms of stages that describe the length of time that information remains available to us. Information begins in sensory memory, and it later on moves to short-term memory and eventually moves to become long-term memory. But not all the information that makes it through all these three stages. Most of it is forgotten, and whether the information moves from shorter duration memory to longer duration memory or whether it is lost from memory entirely depends on how the information is attended to and processed. Now, sensory memory refers to the brief storage of sensory information. Sensory memory is not found in the table in Adams or in our Adams textbook, but I'm mentioning it nevertheless because a lot of studies have involved that there is such a thing as sensory memory. Sensory memory is a memory buffer that lasts only very briefly and then, unless it is attended to and passed on for more processing, it is eventually forgotten. The purpose of sensory memory is to give the brain some time to process the incoming sensations from all of our senses and to allow us to see the world as an unbroken stream of events rather than as individual pieces. So there are other subtypes of sensory memory. So you have all the senses. So you have the olfactory sense, you have touch, you have visual, you have gustatory, and you have auditory. But there are other names for sensory memories. You have visual sensory memory, which is known as iconic memory. You also have auditory memory, which is known as echoic memory. And then you have tactile or touch, which is also known as haptic memory. So if we base our discussion of memory through using our Adams textbook, memory can be broadly classified into short-term and long-term memory. So under the category of short-term memory is working memory. So it includes again short-term recall of objects, plans, names, and sequencings. Example of short-term memory or working memory are daily acts of hearing a phone number and retaining it in order to be able to walk across a room and dial the phone, and then performing a series of mental calculations that require holding an intermediate sum briefly in mind. So now we proceed with the discussion on long-term memory. So long-term memory can be viewed from the perspective of the individual's awareness of learning new material, or what we call explicit memory, which is conscious, or not being conscious of the event of acquiring memory, which is also called implicit memory. So how do you remember this? Explicit is conscious, you are aware. Implicit is unconscious, where you are unaware that you are acquiring memory. Under explicit memory or conscious memory are episodic and semantic. Episodic is also known as autobiographical, and it refers to knowledge or experiences that can be consciously remembered. So, episodic memory refers to first-hand experiences that we have had. Example, recollections of our high school graduation or the day we had dinner in this fancy restaurant. And then the second type is semantic memory. So, semantic is factual memory, and it refers to our knowledge of facts and concepts about the world. This is the ability to learn the nature of the environment and factual knowledge. Example, the shape and color of a lion, the location of a country, or in the world map. Simply put, this is what we do every day as students, as residents, as doctor. When we study books, when we study journals, no, when we study our reading materials, then we are in fact gaining semantic memory. Implicit memory refers to the influence of experience on behavior, even if the individual is not aware of those influences. So remember, when we say implicit, it is unconscious. And there are two types of implicit memory: your classical conditioning and your procedural memory. So classical conditioning is learning a procedure in which a biologically potent stimulus is paired with a previously neutral stimulus. Alright? And then for procedural memory, it refers to our often unexplainable knowledge of how we do things or how to do things. Example, when we walk from one place to another, speak to another person in English, dial a cell phone, or play a video game, we are using procedural memory. So procedural memory allows us to perform complex tasks even though we may not be able to explain to others how to do them. There is no way to tell someone how to ride a bicycle, and a person has to learn by doing it. And the idea of implicit memory helps explain how infants are able to learn. The ability to crawl, walk, and talk are procedural memory skills, and these skills are easily and efficiently developed while we are children, despite the fact that as adults we have no conscious memory of how we learned them. So now we ask the question, how are memories converted from short-term to long-term storage? So memory consolidation is the process where our brains convert short-term memories into long-term memories. Short-term memory tends to be quite limited in terms of duration and capacity. So the human brain can only store short-term memories for about 30 seconds. So if we're ever going to remember anything, important information has to be moved to our long-term memory. So in order to
So
understand
to
how
be
memory
able to
consolidation
convert
functions,
short-term
it's
memory into
helpful to
long-term
think
storage,
about
so
how
there are
synapses work
different
in the brain.
mechanisms
So if
involved.
we want to think
So
about
the
synapses like an
cellular
electrical system
mechanisms
conducting a current,
interact
the
with different
synapses in our
anatomic
brain, in our
structures
neurons, pass
involved
the
in
signals from
memory
neuron to
storage.
neuron with the help of different neurotransmitters. So the more frequently signals are passed, the stronger the synapses become. And this process is called potentiation, and it is believed to play a major role in learning and the memory processes. So by rehearsing or recalling information over and over again, these neural networks become strengthened. For example, if you study the same material regularly over a long period, the pathways involved in remembering that information becomes stronger. And the repeated firing of the same neurons makes it more likely
So for the
that those
conversion
same
of
neurons will
short-term to
be able to
long-term
repeat that
storage of
firing
memory,
again
it
in the
involves
future.
both
And
cellular
as a result of that,
mechanisms
we are
and
able to
different
remember the
anatomic
information
structures that
later
are
with greater
involved in
ease and
memory
accuracy.
storage.
So this is why we always tell you as your teachers that cramming is not a good way to store, to make sure that you have long-term memory, because you have just few exposures to the same information. What you need is to study a little bit at a time so that you can consolidate your memories very well into your long-term memory. And then when you review them again, then the synapses become stronger. And when you review them again, by the time exam time comes, then by that time, talagang stock knowledge na siya. So I found you a few memes. Oh, you stay up all night every night cramming for finals, hmm? So please tell me all about how much information you retain long term. I doubt. So cramming never works because when you cram everything all together. Cramming is also known as massed learning compared to the other term, okay, which is called spaced learning. And another meme, which is true. One of my classmates in med school, and I remember her quote no so well and up until now, sabi niya, what you don't know, you'll never know in 5 minutes. So on a molecular level, these are the changes that happen, or these are the processes that are involved with moving your short-term memory into long-term memory. So you have ongoing electrical activity, you have changes in your level of electrolytes, of your ions, of your neurotransmitters, and then you can have protein phosphorylation and gene expression, and then later on there can be additional changes in gene transcription and translation, resulting in structural changes of proteins and neurons. And in terms of the anatomical structures involved at different times for storage of explicit memories, so for attention and registration, you have your brainstem diencephalic regions, your frontoparietal association networks, and your specific unimodal and heteromodal cortices. When we move from short-term to working memory, you have your frontal association cortex and specific unimodal and heteromodal cortices working. And during consolidation, it's the medial temporal structures, the medial diencephalic structures, and of course your specific unimodal and heteromodal cortices. And years on, you have your specific unimodal and heteromodal cortices, which make sure that you have your stock knowledge. A useful table is seen in your ADAMS, and it tells us the different neuropsychological categories of memory. So in terms of conscious access with implicit memory, no, usually we don't have conscious access. Okay, but for the all the other types of memory you have now, for the explicit, especially for immediate recall and working memory. And kindly take note of the anatomic regions involved in the different categories of memory, as well as the conditions that disturb memory. So I'll leave you to your reading with this table. Our third topic is emotion. So emotion may be defined as any feeling or state, for example, of fear, anger, excitement, love, or hate, associated with certain autonomic and mainly visceral body changes or bodily changes. If the emotion is intense, there may ensue a disturbance of intellectual functions, examples of which are a disorganization of rational thought and a tendency toward a more automatic behavior of unmodulated or stereotyped character. And in its most easily recognized human form, emotion is initiated by a stimulus, either real or imagined, the perception of which involves recognition, memory, and specific associations. So what are the components of emotion? First is the perception of a stimulus, which may be internal, meaning an idea, or an external stimulus. The second component is the feeling. The third component would be the autonomic and visceral changes associated with that feeling. And the fourth component is the outward display, or what we call affect. And the fifth is this impulse to a certain type of activity. This sounds very, very theoretical, but let's put it in a term or a situation that is applicable for everyone. So, for example, you saw your crush. That is your stimulus. And you say, oh my goodness, he's so guapo, or he's so handsome, or she's so pretty. And you have that evoked feeling. And, 'di ba, you can feel all those butterflies in your stomach, you can feel your heart thumping, you can feel palpitations, you can even have cold sweats in your hands. That's your autonomic and visceral changes. And they say that your pupils dilate when you see someone you like. And then, of course, you have your outward display or your affect. Syempre, andyan yung batting of your eyelashes, nandyan yung pa sweep-sweep ng hair, and then, the last is the impulse to a certain type of activity. So, that impulse, yeah, you want to talk to him, or you want to talk to her, you want to be with her, you want to do something for her. So, those are the components of emotion. And the occurrence of abnormal emotional reactions in the course of disease is associated with lesions that preferentially involve certain parts of the nervous system grouped under the term limbic lobe. And these are among the most complex and least understood parts of the nervous system. Paul Broca was the first to describe the limbic lobe to include the ring of gray matter formed primarily by the cingulate gyrus, the parahippocampal gyri, and that encircles the corpus callosum and the underlying upper brainstem. So, the boundaries of the limbic lobe include the cingulate gyrus, the parahippocampal formation, and the subcallosal gyrus, and the para-olfactory area. So the terms visceral brain and limbic system completely describe the structures involved in emotion and its expression. So in addition to the limbic lobe, there are a number of associated subcortical nuclei, such as those of the amygdaloid complex, the septal region, the preoptic area here near the hypothalamus, the anterior the anterior thalamus, the habenula, where's the habenula here? Here, the habenula, and then you also have the central midbrain tegmentum here, including the raphe nuclei and the interpeduncular nucleus. So these make up the limbic system. The connections between the orbitofrontal neocortex and the limbic lobes, between the individual components of the limbic lobes, and between the limbic lobes and the hypothalamus and midbrain reflect their many functional relationships in regard to emotion. At the core of this system lies the medial forebrain bundle, which is a complex set of ascending and descending fibers that connect the orbitomesofrontal cortex, the septal nuclei, um, and the amygdala, and the hippocampus rostrally, no, and certain nuclei in the midbrain and caudal pons. This system is called the septo-hypothalamo-mesencephalic continuum. Aside from that, there are many other interrelationships among the various parts of the limbic system. The best known of these is the Papez circuit. It leads from the hippocampus via the fornix to the mammillary body and the septal and preoptic regions. The mammillothalamic tract, or the bundle of Vic-Diazier, connects the mammillary nuclei to the anterior nucleus of the thalamus, which in turn project to the cingulate gyrus, and then via the cingulum back to the via the cingulum back to the hippocampus. So the cingulum runs concentric to the curvature of the corpus callosum. This is your corpus callosum. Sorry, this is your corpus callosum. And it connects the various parts of the limbic lobe to one another and projects to the striatum and to certain brainstem nuclei. Also, the cingulum receives fibers from the inferior parietal lobule and temporal lobe. The brain processes emotions in a series of steps. First, incoming information must be appraised and assigned an emotional value. So see here, this is inside out. You have fear, you have anger, you have joy, you have sadness, and you have disgust. And this process is often very quick and may go beyond our conscious awareness. Even so, our initial emotional reaction depends on a number of individual biases and contexts. We can then identify and feel the emotion. So depending on the social situation, we may have to regulate that emotion's expression. For example, there are times where we want to express rage or anger or disgust, but we have to keep within the social norms and try to stay as calm as possible. The best of the best understood emotion is that of fear. Fear relative to external circumstances is triggered by the amygdala. But the emotion program of disgust is another good example of protection of the organism's integrity. Disgust is triggered from a small region in the anterior insular cortex when certain stimuli are present. For example, food that you don't like, a suitor that you don't feel. And compassion is another emotion whose trigger region has been identified. And this site is located in the ventral and medial sector of the prefrontal cortex. So positron emission studies, positron emission tomography scanning have shown that some emotions are more likely to be associated with different regions of the limbic system. So for example, happiness activates several areas of the brain including the right frontal cortex, the precuneus, the left amygdala, and the left insula. Okay, fear activates the bilateral amygdala, the hypothalamus, and areas of the left frontal cortex. Sadness is associated with an increased activity of the right occipital lobe, the left insula, the left thalamus, amygdala, and the hippocampus. Disgust is an interesting feeling that is often associated with avoidance. This emotion is associated with activation of connections between the left amygdala, left inferior frontal cortex, and the insular cortex. And anger is an important emotion that many people, adults and children, try to control. Anger is associated with activation of the right hippocampus, the amygdala, and both sides of the prefrontal cortex and the insular cortex. So there's another emotion, that of surprise. So surprise can go either way. So it can make you feel good or it can make you feel bad. Surprise activates the bilateral inferior frontal gyri and the bilateral hippocampus. Nice to know. Okay, so we are in part 2 of our lecture. We're going to discuss disorders of memory and emotions, not really about intelligence. And we'll start off with an overview of dementia. So, what is dementia? Dementia is an umbrella term used to describe a range of symptoms associated with cognitive impairment. So, a lot of times, people interchange dementia with Alzheimer's disease, but actually, Alzheimer's is under the umbrella term of dementia. So, the most common cause of dementia is still Alzheimer's at around 50 to 75%. And then this is followed by vascular dementia, followed by Lewy body disease or Lewy body dementia or dementia with Lewy bodies, and the frontotemporal dementias or the frontotemporal lobe degenerations. So let's quickly discuss this takeoff case so that you'll understand the different terminologies under the term of dementia later on. So this takeoff case is about Mr. Smith, a 73-year-old male who has a chief complaint of yearly checkup with his wife. So he doesn't really have complaints. He's coming in for an executive checkup. After reviewing the conditions on his problem list, his wife mentions that she has had concerns about his forgetfulness. Mr. Smith is quick to point out that he doesn't feel that his forgetfulness interferes with his activity. The patient's wife elaborates, "Over the past year, our children and I have noticed that Mr. Smith often asks the same question over and over again, and he hardly ever remembers our conversation, and he doesn't remember appointments. Yet he has had no difficulties with driving or with direction, and he is still an excellent handyman." So this case, this takeoff case is a common example of what we see in the clinics when people come in and say, "Doctora, I seem to be more forgetful than usual. Am I demented? Do I have the Alzheimer?" So given his case, what is your impression? Is it normal aging? Is it mild cognitive impairment? Or is it dementia? The answer is mild cognitive impairment. So how do you differentiate normal aging, mild cognitive impairment, or MCI, and dementia? We utilize certain diagnostic criteria, and the most commonly used would be the DSM and the NIH, or National Institute on Aging, the NIH National Institute on Aging. The DSM is used for clinical diagnosis, and it also includes other types of dementia. And the NIH scoring is mainly used for research purposes, and it focuses primarily on Alzheimer's disease. So we will be focusing our discussion on the DSM-5 criteria. So under the DSM-5 classification, we have the following: mild neurocognitive disorder or prodromal disease or mild cognitive impairment, and major neurocognitive disorder. So the neurocognitive domains that are evaluated or that are utilized for the DSM criteria are complex attention, which includes sustained attention, selective attention, and information processing speed; executive function, which includes planning, decision making, working memory, responding to feedback, inhibition, and mental flexibility; learning and memory, which includes free recall, cued recall, recognition memory, semantic and autobiographical long-term memory, and implicit learning. The fourth domain is language, which includes object naming, word finding, fluency, grammar, and syntax, and receptive language. The next domain is perceptual motor function, which includes visual perception, visual constructional reasoning, and perceptual motor coordination. And the last domain is social cognition, which includes the recognition of emotions, theory of mind, and insight. The DSM criteria is not really elucidated in your ADAMS, but it is an important criteria, and it makes the diagnosis of MCI more distinct and more clear. So for mild cognitive impairment, the requirements include a modest cognitive decline from previous level of performance in one or more domains as reported by the patient, a knowledgeable informant, or a clinician; neurocognitive deficits of 1 to 2 standard deviations. The patient is still able to do ADLs, or activities of daily living, but with greater effort and compensatory strategies or accommodation. mild cognitive impairment does not occur or do not occur in the context of delirium, and it is not attributable to another mental disorder, and you should specify one or more etiologic subtypes due to. With major neurocognitive disorder, the requirements for diagnosis are: letter A, a substantial decline from previous level of performance in one or more domain, and it is reported by the patient, a knowledgeable informant or clinician, and the neurocognitive deficits should be greater than 2 standard deviations. Remember, in MCI, it's about 1 to 2 standard deviations. With major neurocognitive disorder, it should be greater or higher. And the the symptoms or the deficits interfere with ADLs, and they do not occur in the context of delirium. They are not attributable to another mental disorder, and we should also specify one or more etiologic subtypes like due to. So these are the different etiologic subtypes of the cognitive disorders. You have Alzheimer's disease, you have cerebrovascular diseases or your vascular cognitive disorder, you have frontotemporal lobar degeneration or frontotemporal neurocognitive disorder, dementia with Lewy bodies or neurocognitive disorder with Lewy bodies, Parkinson's disease, Huntington's disease, traumatic injury, HIV infection, prion disease, other medical conditions, and multiple etiologies. So this is from the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, 5th edition. So the thing is, we all grow older, and if you have older family members, and a common running joke would be, oh, this is a senior moment. But what distinguishes senior moments from the development of neurocognitive disorders? So this shows us a trajectory of cognitive functioning as age progresses. So this red broken line is the trajectory of a person destined to die non-demented, and the black solid line is the trajectory of a person destined to develop dementia. So there is a threshold for cognitive impairment, and once a patient reaches this threshold for mild cognitive impairment, then it is just a matter of time before dementia, full-blown dementia develops and progresses. Okay, so a person destined never to become cognitively impaired during life only shows minimal decline in cognitive function as part of normal aging, but a person destined to develop dementia has a continuous nature of cognitive decline. Using the National Institute on Aging and Alzheimer's Association scoring or flow process, there are 3 phases of AD or Alzheimer's disease progression. There is preclinical AD, wherein the disease is present in the brain and beta amyloid is continually accumulating, but there are no symptoms. And then preclinical AD progresses to mild cognitive impairment due to AD, or what we call prodromal Alzheimer's disease, wherein there are already memory complaints or memory and other complaints, and the patients are abnormal when formally tested, but the impairment does not yet interfere with activities of daily living. The third phase is dementia caused by AD. And in this phase, memory and other cognitive difficulties already interfere with the activities of daily living. So in this figure, in this diagram, you see that in preclinical AD, so this can be a long period of time. This can start in the 40s, 50s. There is beta amyloid accumulation, the beginning of neuronal injury, but there are no cognitive symptoms. In this phase of mild cognitive impairment, beta amyloid further accumulates and there is progression of neuronal injury, but the patients are the cognitive symptoms do not yet interfere with the ADL. So the patients are still able to do ADLs. And in the third phase, dementia due to AD, there is beta amyloid accumulation plus neuronal injury plus cognitive symptoms that interfere with ADLs. So this red line is your beta amyloid um, progression or accumulation, and this blue line indicates neuronal injury, and the purple line indicates cognitive symptoms. Okay, so in the clinics, when we are presented with patients who complain of cognitive decline or patients who are referred to us for cognitive evaluation, we have to be able to rule out reversible causes of dementia because they can be treatable. And the mnemonics are also given through dementia. D for drugs, E for emotional components like depression, M for metabolic or endocrine causes, E for eyes and ears declining because some people you'd think are demented are actually hard of hearing or hard of vision. N for normal pressure hydrocephalus because this is a condition that presents with a triad of cognitive dysfunction, gait instability, and urinary incontinence. Cognitive or behavioral changes. T for tumors or other space occupying lesions. I for infections like syphilis or neurosyphilis or HIV. And A for anemia due to vitamin B12 or folate deficiency. So this is a practical table to use when trying to distinguish between age-related memory impairment or normal aging, mild cognitive impairment, and dementia. So in all cases, there can be subjective cognitive decline. The patient is going to say, parang mahina na po yung memory ko, or it's so hard for me to memorize, or I forget a lot of things. So check on this. And in terms of a decline in objective cognitive assessment using your MMSE or your MoCA, in age-related memory impairment, there is no decline. But in MCI and dementia, you can see that patients struggle to achieve passing scores in these tests. In the domain of ADLs, or when you evaluate ADLs are not affected in age-related memory impairment and MCI, but ADLs are affected in dementia. And in terms of brain imaging is normal for aging or expected for aging in age-related memory impairment, but you see more pronounced atrophy and degenerative changes in MCI and dementia. So as of the moment, brain imaging and other biomarkers are not yet recommended for clinical diagnosis and are still very useful in the field of research criteria. Okay, this is a very interesting syndrome, the amnesia syndromes or the amnesic-Korsakoff syndrome. Honestly, I've not yet seen this kind of amnesia in clinical practice, but it's always discussed in the books. So the amnesic state or the Korsakoff syndrome consists of two salient features. The first is retrograde amnesia, which is the inability to recall events and other information that had been firmly established before the onset of the illness. And the second is anterograde amnesia, which is the inability to acquire new information, to learn, or to form new memories. Included in the syndrome of Korsakoff syndrome is confabulation. It is included in the definition of Korsakoff amnesic state, but not really a requisite for diagnosis. But confabulation is defined as the creative falsification of memory in an alert, responsive individual. And there can be two forms, momentary or fantastic. So momentary is evident only on probing, but fantastic confabulation is evident in general conversation. So examples are the spouse as an impostor, the hospital as a hotel or home. But the thing is, a lot of times patients who have delirium would say that the hospital is their house or the hospital is their hotel. And then, yeah, that's that's something we see a lot in delirious or hallucinating patients.
There are two
So
anatomic
in terms of
structures
the
that we need to
anatomic basis with
remember,
amnesic
which explains
syndrome,
the
two
anatomic
important
basis of the
structures are
amnesic syndrome. So
implicated.
one
The
would be the
thalamus,
thalamus,
specifically the medial
specifically the
portion
medial
of the
portion
dorsomedial
of the
thalamus and the
dorsomedial
adjacent
part of the thalamus
midline
and
thalamic
the
nuclei,
adjacent
and
midline
the
nuclei.
hippocampal
And number
formations of the
two
medial
is the
temporal lobe.
hippocampal formations of the
So the amnesic state is comprised of several classifications. The Korsakoff syndrome is just one of them. So you have a general breakdown of the amnesic states. You have amnesic syndrome of sudden onset, usually with gradual but incomplete recovery. So that's caused a lot by strokes, trauma, cardiac arrest, status epilepticus, and delirium. You also have amnesia of sudden onset and short duration, and usually this is caused by seizures and transient global amnesia as well as hysteria. And then you have the amnesic syndrome of subacute onset with varying degrees of recovery, but usually leaving permanent residua. So you have your alcoholic Wernicke-Korsakoff syndrome, you have your herpes simplex encephalitis, and your other forms of meningitis. And then you also have the slowly progressive amnesic states, which are brought about by tumors, Alzheimer's disease, and other neurodegenerative disorders, and paraneoplastic and immune encephalitis. So let's talk about transient global amnesia because this is a condition that I've seen and a lot of neurologists have seen once in a while in their practice. So transient global amnesia from the word itself is transient, meaning it is fleeting, it is short limit or it is limited. No? It's the abrupt development of retrograde and anterograde amnesia with no obvious cause and no other deficits. The episodes often occur in the setting of physical exertion or emotional stress, and it typically lasts for 4 to 12 hours, after which the patient recovers fully, except for a permanent loss of memory for a few hours before and after the onset. So the patient's behavior is normal except for a very characteristic incessant repetitive questioning about immediate circumstances like what am I doing here? How did we get here? So the differential diagnosis for TGA are temporal lobe seizures and transient ischemic attacks. So in my clinical practice, I've seen several patients with who present as transient global amnesia. And most of the time, if you probe the history is the most important, actually, the history is the most important um, thing that you have to really get into detail because they come in saying, Doktora, meron po akong nakalimutan or it's not even the patient who will tell you that there was a memory gap. It would be the people around, the family members. As you say, doctor, there was a time that she totally forgot where she was. She couldn't remember and all that. So when you probe, the patient usually would have a very, a more depressed mood or because they're questioning what happened to them. But when with further probing, usually it is preceded, the event is preceded by an emotional episode. So either may nakaaway sila, may nakagalit sila, or the patient was visibly upset, and then there would be a period of time wherein blanco. They can't remember. And the next thing that they remember was, how did I get here? what was happening, or the only reason why the patients realized that there was a problem was because the family member was questioning them or was asking them what happened. So that is the typical scenario of your TGA. And if you do the mental status examination, the neurological examination during the time that it happened, then it would be uh, normal already if the patient is seen in the outpatient clinic. Kasi ibig sabihin, it happened after, they come to you after the event already. But I have seen a few patients who were admitted to the hospital during the state of TGA. And I will share you an example. I remember this very, very well. This happened when I was a third year resident because the patient who came in for TGA was a medical resident during that time. So and the interesting thing was, so it was 2007 then. I was third year or second year, yeah, third year or 2008. But she and her husband had a very big fight. And the next thing that happened was she went back to the condo, and she didn't know that something was wrong. But her sister noted that when she came back to the room, to the condo, one of her slippers was missing. So it raised a level of suspicion in the sister that something was not wrong, was not right. So, and then when she was questioning her, she didn't, the sister, the medical resident, didn't know her or didn't know her very well, and there were bits of and pieces of information that was missing. So dinala siya sa ER, and during the time that we were in the ER, we were evaluating her, and we asked her, what year is it? What year is it, do you remember now? So remember, this was in 2007 or 2008. And she said it's 1997. So her TGA was bad enough that she regressed like 10 years from the time of, from the present time. So this patient was in that, state of TGA for like yeah, I think 2 days. And then eventually, she snapped out of it. Eventually, she recalled everything. But the thing is, when they start recalling, there is still this period of amnesia where, from one particular time point to another, they would be missing the information for that specific several hours. And that's what is interesting, because from a psychological perspective, that is your brain, that is your mind protecting you from more emotional trauma. If they forget that this period of time existed, then siguro that is the defense mechanism of our mind to protect ourselves from further pain. So in TGA, the imaging findings are usually normal. In some patients, there can be some hippocampal and perihippocampal lesions with diffusion-weighted MRI, and it can be seen like the clinical syndrome, but these findings are reversible. In TGA, no treatment is required. Time is the best treatment for TGA because eventually they get better. So after you give it time, after you give the patient a lot of nursing care and supportive care, you just have to explain the nature of the attack and reassurance. And that is why I so strongly disagree with these, teledramas wherein there's such a protracted period of amnesia in the patients and the protagonists. Kasi in real life, it doesn't really happen like that. Okay? So how do we approach the patient with dementia and the amnestics? So first of all, very important is a reliable history of the illness and its impact on daily life. So you really need a good informant kasi you're not gonna get a lot of things from the patient, but the wife, the family member, the caregiver, they'll be able to tell you all the details that you need. And the findings on the mental status examination should be concordant with dementia or amnesia. Other ancillary examinations like CT, MRI, functional imaging, and sometimes lumbar puncture and EEG, plus appropriate laboratory procedures are part of the baseline examination. So, if an MRI is available in your institution or available in your place, then it's better to do that because you can also do MRI volumetry to measure, the cerebral volume of this patient. Functional imaging, yes, it's nice to do that, but it's not really widely available here in our country, although there are some hospitals that have it. And lumbar puncture, we do that when we suspect normal pressure hydrocephalus. But an EEG is an easy procedure that you can do. It's a routine procedure that you can request for. And in terms of in going back a little bit, in terms of the appropriate laboratory procedures, usually we ask for thyroid function test, creatinine, sodium, yan. In terms of screening tools, we use the mini-mental state exam or the mini-mental status examination and the Montreal Cognitive Assessment. MMSE is the Falstein Mini-Mental Status Exam. It's a 30-point questionnaire used for screening for dementia or cognitive impairment, and the cutoff score is 24. The Montreal Cognitive Assessment or the MOCA is actually what I use in the clinics more because I find it more challenging and it's more accurate in depicting the real, cognitive status of patients because a lot of times the MMSE score can be passing, but the MOCA score um, is points lower than the MMSE scoring. So the MOCA is a 30-item scoring system designed for screening of mild cognitive impairment in those with normal MMSE scores. It has 8 different cognitive domains, including attention and concentration, executive functions, memory, language, visual constructional skills, conceptual thinking, calculations, and orientation. So kung ang MMSE, the passing score is 24, with MOCA it is 26. So the nice thing about the MOCA is it already gives you the different domains that it's evaluating. So me as an examiner, it's clear for me agad na, oh okay, so there's a problem with naming, there's a problem with the visual spatial executive, or there's a problem with attention and all that. So this MOCA has the English version as the standard version, but there is also a Filipino version of the MOCA, or we call it the MOCA P. And this was validated by Dr. Dominguez and company, and it is designed to detect mild cognitive impairment among Filipino elderly. The passing score is 21 with the MOCA P, but if a patient has less than or equal to 7 years of education, meaning umabot lang ng grade 6, then you can add 2 points to the MOCA P score. Okay, so for example, si Lola just reached grade 4 and her score is 19, then you can add 2 points, so the total would be 21. Pasado pa din siya, pasang-awa. So it's if you look at it, what's different would be, of course, everything is in Tagalog, and the animals that are used are the lion, the owl, and the camel instead of the rhinoceros. Okay. In terms of emotional disturbances, so we're in the last part of our lecture. There is a table which lists the emotional disturbances, no? So there are six categories. You have disturbances of emotionality because of perceptual abnormalities and cognitive derangements. So delirious patients may present with hallucinations, with threatening imaginary figures and voices that seem real and inescapable. And in these situations, these delirious patients may display the full picture of terror. So you have your autonomic and visceral changes as well. And their affect, emotional reaction, and visceral and somatic motor responses are appropriate to the content of the hallucinations. And also, there are, there's a difficult state to classify wherein there's overwhelming emotionality in patients who are in severe and acute pain. If you've seen a person in severe pain, di ba, you'd see them crying, you'd see them wailing, you'd see them anxious, and it's really, it's really a very emotional moment. The second major category is disinhibition of emotional expression. So, emotional lability presents as a weakened mechanism over the control of emotional expression. Patients may laugh too much or cry too easily or get angered very easily, and but the emotion is appropriate to the stimulus, meaning OA. Yun in Tagalog, overacting lang. For example, binigyan ka ng bulaklak ng crush mo, ay, and then naman, para kang tatalon, para kang, your laughter, or you're crying, or if you're watching, like, K-drama, tas mega hagulgol ka. But, sometimes that's an expression of normal. Okay? And in terms of pathologic crying and laughing, this is also called the pseudobulbar state. And can you imagine? Look at this. May typographical error si Adams. It should be PSEU. Pseudobulbar palsy or pseudobulbar state or emotional incontinence is a form of disordered emotional expression characterized by outbursts of involuntary, uncontrollable, and stereotyped laughing or crying, and it is generally due to an affectation of the corticobulbar tract. In real life, we see that a lot in patients who have recovered from osmotic demyelination, or in patients who have had a stroke, no, in the pons or in the frontal lobes, or in any stroke that significantly affects the corticobulbar tract. So there is also a category for rage reactions and aggressivity. So all the human and animal data point to an origin of aggressiveness, anger, and rage in the temporal lobes, and particularly in the amygdala. In humans, stimulation of the medial amygdaloid nuclei evokes a display of anger, whereas stimulation of the lateral nuclei does not. And destruction of the amygdaloid complex bilaterally reportedly reduces aggressiveness. Now, your sex hormones influence the activity of these temporal lobe circuits. So, testosterone promotes aggressiveness and estradiol suppresses it, suggesting an explanation for sex differences in the disposition to anger. Now, in terms of rage reactions, the common that comes to mind would be traffic rage or road rage, 'di ba? Seemingly placid individuals, very mild-mannered, when they get stuck in traffic or when someone tries to overtake them, grabe, nagwawala yung kanilang raging hormones siguro. So they have this rage reactions. Okay? Another category of emotional disturbances is apathy and placidity. So a quantitative reduction in all activity is probably the most frequent of all the psychobehavioral affectations or alterations in patients with cerebral disease, particularly those with involvement of the anterior parts of the frontal lobes. So we see a lot of apathy, abulia, in patients with subarachnoid hemorrhage due to ruptured um, anterior communicating artery aneurysm. So you see that apathetic sila, abulic sila. Eventually, they improve a little bit, but sometimes it can be their like resting state afterwards. So bilateral lesions deep in the septal region have resulted in the most striking lack of impulse, spontaneity, and drive. Okay, and the Kluver-Bucy syndrome is one that's commonly written in the books, but you don't really see that a lot, or you don't really see that in clinical practice. So the Kluver-Bucy syndrome results from total bilateral temporal lobectomy in adult rhesus monkeys, and when these lobectomies are performed, placidity and enhanced oral behavior were the most frequent consequences. So lahat kinakain, lahat sinusubo. And altered sexual behavior and visual agnosia were less frequent. So the Kluver-Bucy syndrome, it's nice to know. So, altered sexuality is also another category of emotional disturbances. So, you have hypersexuality or hyposexuality. So, lesions of the orbital frontal lobes may remove moral ethical restraints and lead to indiscriminate sexual behavior. And superior frontal lesions may be associated with a general loss of initiative that includes all, including sexual impulsivity. Now, lesions that involve the tuberoinfundibular region of the hypothalamus are also known to cause specific disturbances in sexual function. But in real life practice, we see hypersexuality among patients with dementia, specifically frontotemporal dementia. And sometimes hypersexuality can be the unpleasant side effect of medications for Parkinson's disease, like levodopa and the other dopamine agonists. A lot of other medications naman, psychotropics, anticonvulsants, yeah, they can lead to decrease in libido. So the last category of emotional disturbances would include endogenous fear, anxiety, depression, and euphoria. So this part is really, emotions are really in the realm of neurology and psychiatry. But the neuronal circuits subserving fear are coextensive with those of anger. And both these emotions are part to lie in the medial part of the temporal lobe and amygdala. On the other hand, elation and euphoria are less well documented as limbic phenomena but are seen as part of temporal lobe seizures. Now, depression, this is another chapter altogether, so I'll just leave you to the reading in your books. So this is my last slide. I hope that you learned something new for today. And please, always refer to Adams for reference, especially when we are preparing to study for the examination. So when I was preparing for my thank you slide, I thought of looking for a quote that would encompass memory, intelligence, and emotions. So the human brain is fascinating. We will forget a scent until we smell it again. We will erase a voice from our memory until we hear it again. And even emotions that seem buried forever will be awakened when we return to the same place. Thank you.